Rama, Hare Hare,
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare.
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama,
Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. Jaya Kodanitai, Jaya Maya Pochachi, Jaya Kodanitai, Jaya Maya Pochachi. Jaya Shritosina, Jaya Shritosina, Shritosina, Jaya Shritosina. Jaya Giridhari Lal, Jaya Giridhari Lal, Giridhari Lal, Jaya Giridhari Lal. Jaya Nrsingadev, Jaya Nrsingadev, Jaya Nrsingadev, Jaya Nrsingadev. Jaya Vrindadevi, Jaya Vrindadevi, Jaya Vrindadevi, Jaya Vrindadevi. Jaya Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada, Prabhupada, Jaya Prabhupada. Shri Shri Karnachai Mai Pashashi Ki Jai, Shri Sasnath Maharaj Ki Jai, Shri Guru Lal Ki Jai, Shri Nrsingadev Bhagavan Ki Jai, Srimati Vrindadevi Ki, Shri Prabhupada Ki, Anantakoti Vaishnavinda Ki, Grantra Srimad Bhagavatam Ki, Jai Gaura Premanandi. Reading from Srila Prabhupada Lilamrita. Gaura Mohan was a pure Vaishnava and he raised his son to be Krishna conscious. Since his own parents had also been Vaishnavas, Gaura Mohan had never touched meat, fish, eggs, tea, or coffee. His complexion was fair and his disposition reserved. At night, before locking his cloth shop, he would set a bowl of rice in the middle of the floor to satisfy the rats, so they wouldn't gnaw the cloth in their hunger. On returning home, he would read from Chaitanya Charitamrita and Srimad Bhagavatam, the main scriptures of Bengali Vaishnavas, chant on his japa beads, and worship the deity of Lord Krishna. He was gentle and affectionate and would never punish Abai. Even when obliged to correct him, he would first apologize. You are my son, now I must correct you. It is my duty. Even Chaitanya Mahaprabhu's father would chastise him, so don't mind. A picture always remained in Prabhupada's memory of his father's devotional worship of Lord Krishna. He would recall how his father used to come home late at night from the cloth shop and faithfully perform his worship of Lord Krishna before the home altar. We would be sleeping, Prabhupada recalled, and father would be doing arati. We would hear the ding, ding, ding. We would hear the bell and wake up and see him bowing down before Krishna. Srila Prabhupada ki. What's the verse? Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya. Reading from Srimad Bhagavatam, Canto 6, Chapter 1, The History of the Life of Ajamil, Text 22. Bandhyakshai, Kaitavaish, Choryair, Bandhyakshai, Kaitavaish, Choryair, Garhitang, Vritim, Astita, Garhitam Vrittim Astita, Bibrat, Kutumbam, Asuchya, Bibrat Kutumbam Asuchya, Yatayam, Asa, Dehina, Yatayamasa Dehina, Bandhyakshay Kaitavaish Choryay, Garhitang Vrittimastita, Vibrat Kutumbam Asuchya, Yatayamasa Dehina, Bandhyakshay Kaitavaish Choryay, Garhitam Vrittimastita, Vibrat Kutumbam Asuchya, Yatayamasa Dehina, Bandhyakshay Kaitavaish Choryay, Garhitang Vrittimastita, Vibrat Kutumbam Asuchya, Yatayamasa Dehina, Vaishnavis. Dandi Akshay, by unnecessarily arresting someone. Kaitavai, by cheating and gambling or throwing dice. Choryai, by committing theft. Garhitam, condemned. Vrittim, professions. Astita, who has undertaken, because of association with a prostitute. Vibrat, maintaining. Kutumbam, his dependent wife and children. Asuchi, being most sinful. Yatayam asa, he gave trouble. Tehina, to other living entities. Translation. His fallen Brahmana, Ajamil, gave trouble to others by arresting them, by cheating them in gambling, or by directly plundering them. This was the way he earned his livelihood and maintained his wife and children. Please repeat. This fallen Brahmana, Ajamila, gave trouble to others by arresting them, by cheating them in gambling, or by directly plundering them. This was the way he earned his livelihood and maintained his wife and children. Purport by Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada ki. This verse indicates how degraded one becomes simply by indulging in illicit sex with a prostitute. Illicit sex is not possible with a chaste or aristocratic woman, but only with unchaste Shudras. The more society allows prostitution and illicit sex, the more impetus it gives to cheaters, thieves, plunderers, drunkards, and gamblers. Therefore, we first advise all the disciples in our Krishna consciousness movement to avoid illicit sex, which is the beginning of all abominable life, and which is followed by meat-eating, gambling, and intoxication one after another. Of course, restraint is very difficult, but it is quite possible if one fully surrenders to Krishna, since all these abominable habits gradually become distasteful for a Krishna-conscious person. If illicit sex is allowed to increase in a society, however, the entire society will be condemned, for it will be full of rogues, thieves, cheaters, and so forth. Mugyanatmanandasya Gananjana Shalakaya Chukshuramitam Jena Tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Vanshakapatarubhyascha Kripasindhubhyevacha Patitanam Bhavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Jaya Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadhara Shri Sadigoda Bhaktivinoda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Hare Hare. So, both in the verse and in the purport here, Srila Prabhupada is really trying to help us understand the absolute necessity of organizing society in such a way that the purpose of human life is obvious to at least the educated classes, and that those persons who have had the opportunity to understand the purpose of life, that purpose is very much emphasized in all of their activities, in all their association. So the material universe is, i.e., that part of the cosmic manifestation in which the living entities have to accept temporary material bodies according to their karma. It's organized in such a way that the living entities can maintain the illusion that they are enjoyers, and therefore they're given this material energy to exploit and to attempt to fulfill their independent desires. And then it's also designed in such a way that those desires will ultimately be frustrated. And the social orders, the social orders of Brahman, Kshatriya, Vaishya, and Shudra, and also the social classes and the social ashrams of brahmachari, grihastha, vanaprastha, and sannyas. These are organized in such a way that those persons who've understood that repeated attempts to try to gain satisfaction from enjoying this temporary material energy is futile, so that persons who've come to that understanding can then organize their lives in such a way that they can cultivate detachment and cultivate all of the Brahminical qualities which will ultimately lead them to reinstatement in the spiritual energy and will enable them to experience true satisfaction and true enjoyment. So these two purposes of the material existence continue perpetually side by side. And even though this was actually in this pastime took place in Treta Yuga, when I've heard some devotees say that it's Treta Yuga and others say that it's Satya Yuga. But anyway, it definitely wasn't Kali Yuga. So even at that time, there were still persons who were so determined to gratify the gross senses of their material bodies that they'd completely ignore the varnashram rules and regulations, and they had their own societies and their own cultures and their own ways of living, and that was permitted by the administrators. They were cared for, but they were cared for at a distance, and there was no intermingling of those two different ways of life in general. But here in this pastime, we see that Ajami somehow or other came into contact with someone from that society of gross hedonists whose only goal in life was to gratify the senses. And because in his heart, then there were still some remnants of those desires for sense gratification, and he was captivated. His heart was captured by that mood of sense gratification. And now, because the leaders and administrators and educators in positions of power in all of the societies of this planet generally don't understand this dynamic, and they're not protecting persons from that subtle influence of gross sense gratification, which is manifest here in illicit sex, meat eating, gambling, and intoxication. Because of the nature of the society in the world today, because several powerful European nations, right, in their attempt to exploit the resources of the planet, they've kind of spread their hedonistic culture throughout the planet. So it's become like the default culture is sense gratification. So even though persons who have studied history and studied philosophy and studied sociology and criminology, even though they understand something of the necessity for protecting the citizens from this kind of base activity, the commercial world prevents them from doing so. And any attempt to legislate against persons' kind of free will to indulge in whatever activity they desire, it's kind of condemned as some kind of extremism or as something against human rights. But there's no question of human rights if persons become engaged in less than human activities. So actually, human rights legislation should be to protect humans, to protect the human right to have the intelligence to understand the difference between matter and spirit, the difference between activities which will elevate them to a platform of clarity and chastity and purification, and to encourage those activities. This would be actually real human rights legislation. But what human rights has more become really is that it's protecting the right of human beings to become animals, or protecting, and also protecting the rights of human beings to kill innocent creatures. Right? So it's like completely upside down. So therefore, because it is completely upside down, then somebody who's very deeply versed in Vedic Shastra, like Srila Prabhupada, they're seen as being, a fanatic, an anachronism, or someone who's trying to take society back to some kind of oppressive kind of regime. And so we've definitely become very severely contaminated by this kind of culture of laissez-faire, so-called human rights. So, it's one thing is but one thing that's actually quite encouraging in that society, actually, Srila Prabhupada said that if scientists are sincere in their studies for trying to understand the laws of nature and the absolute truth, if they're actually sincere, then they will, by that scientific method, eventually come to understanding the nature of the absolute truth. So now there's actually a branch of medicine called evidence-based medicine, because doctors most doctors enter the profession of being a doctor because they actually have a genuine desire to want to help people become more healthy. But doctors actually have come to understand that the nature of the commercial world has forced them into a situation where, rather than protecting the health of the citizens, they're protecting the health of big multinational corporations by prescribing all of the drugs that they're encouraged to prescribe. And now, partly due to their own awareness and partly due to public pressure, they can see that it's actually causing so much sickness, causing so much death, causing so many new diseases. So now they're actually acknowledging that if we really want to help people, we have to see what works, not what has become the system, what has become the dynamic due to the inertia of greedy persons who've become greedy because of being exposed to a greedy system, which actually Krishna set up. Krishna set up that system of allowing people to be greedy to try to satisfy their desires. So we can see actually that in that sense, the whole medical profession is now coming to the kind of jnana platform of understanding that this attempt to just give people maximum sense gratification by giving them lots of drugs by which they can forget that they're actually sick, that it's not working. So now they're actually encouraging people to, stop sinful activity. This should give us a lot of encouragement and faith to arm ourselves with deep Vedic studies so we can preach to intelligent persons who are actually themselves gradually waking up to this situation. This, in the purport, Srila Prabhupada talks about the chastity of aristocratic women. In one class on this section of Srimad Bhagavatam, Srila Prabhupada describes that it's natural for a woman to protect their chastity even with their life, and also to expect that chastity from their husbands, to expect that extreme adherence to a highly philosophical culture and a very refined culture. They expect that from their husbands. Actually, this is where the expression "a real gentleman" comes from. He's a real gentleman. That means a real gentleman means someone who will always do the right thing, even if others are laughing or deriding them, or even if it's causing them financial loss, or even if it's causing them physical harm, they'll do the right thing. But actually, a gentleman, when the marketing machine of the global commercialism decided that it wasn't very easy to sell their produce to gentlemen, then they started to in the media, they started to deride gentlemen as being old-fashioned and instead they promoted qualities of Machiavellian qualities, and like they created this kind of this anti-hero. They turned criminals and debauchees into heroes. And in that way, the concept of like a gentleman, or the concept of a very chaste lady, has become something which is seen as against progress or against the well-being of society. And in one sense, this has led to this situation where now everyone is encouraged to somehow fulfill all of their desires, however much those desires may be against their long-term interest, but they're kind of encouraged to, everyone's encouraged to have the opportunity to discover all of the kind of different aspects of their psyche, and now businesses are kind of trying to capitalize on that by creating markets, which are basically just kind of reflections of people's anarthas. So when we read Srila Prabhupada's books, we can see that he understands all of these concepts. And as I say now, that persons in positions of power in government and in the media also are beginning to see this, then we can be more confident to preach in this way. I was actually speaking with Raghunath a few weeks ago about a very amazing lecture which was given in 1978 by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a Russian author who originally fought for the Russians in the Second World War. But then, just because in one of his poems, he made some derogatory remark about Joseph Stalin, then he was put in prison in Russia for several years in a labor camp, and then he became famous because he wrote two novels, The Gulab Archipelago and The Cancer Ward, which won him the Nobel Prize. And because he became so famous, then he managed to, with the help of lots of academics and other persons, he managed to take up residence in the USA. But then, having lived there for several years, he was invited to give a speech at Harvard University. And I can't remember the name of the speech now. But anyway, it was the biggest crowd of academics that had ever gathered to hear anyone speak at a university. It was held outside, and there were like tens of thousands of people there. And basically he said that, having lived in the West for 5 or 6 years, he actually was now inclined to go back to the Soviet Union, because he felt that the Western people had lost their hearts, they'd lost their courage, and they'd lost their morals due to the attempt to satisfy everybody's degraded desires, right, in the name of egalitarianism, in the name of equal rights. That a nation which was built on in God we trust had become a nation that had become in lust we trust. And so it was like, and he spoke, it was like such a powerful speech. It was really incredible. And it was almost like saying, he was almost saying really like, I'd rather be in prison in a country that's got some moral fiber, than a hero in a country which has lost its heart. So that's also Srila Prabhupada's strength, and we can feel empowered that, you know, Solzhenitsyn had some idea. He was actually a spiritual. He had some Christian leanings, and he was a very deep thinking and very renounced person. But but Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada understands the whole system. He actually understands everything about the reason for that kind of dynamic which had taken place. Whereas Solzhenitsyn didn't understand. He wasn't part of that sampradaya that could enable him to understand. And also the people of America couldn't really understand him either. In fact, he got booed and hissed by many of the audience on that day. So Srila Prabhupada, Srila Prabhupada was actually preaching to an even more difficult audience. He was preaching to the hippies who'd actually, although to some degree they'd rejected Western materialism, but because their hearts weren't purified, then they were, rather than replacing it with like genuine spirituality, they'd replaced it with kind of free sex, free love. But now we can see, now we've got the benefit of hindsight to be able to see all of these different dynamics in world history, these different movements. And now things are becoming very clear. So we can, with confidence, we can embrace this science of Krishna consciousness. And it is actually a very precise science. And although Srila Prabhupada adapted to some degree the science for that very difficult audience which he first encountered, but now we've got so much literature and so many different biographies and histories of the tradition and biographies and histories of the other culture to see how empires have fallen due to moral degradation again and again and again. Even though the people who established most of the great empires were established by real heroes, real gentlemen, and real leaders. But very quickly, because they allowed sense gratification, they became degraded. So now people are actually applying this kind of principle of strong moral behavior, and they've got many different ways, some of which include yoga, which have rules and regulations and different protocols. So our protocols are those which Srila Prabhupada has taken from the Vedic literature, and especially the teachings of Lord Chaitanya to the Goswamis, and as presented in the Nectar of Devotion, which is Srila Prabhupada describes as the complete science of devotional service. So part of that science, and especially the part which teaches us chastity and which teaches us humility, is the science of paying obeisances and of bowing down to Krishna, bowing down to the deity of Krishna, bowing down to Krishna's devotees. And this is a very helpful process. We may not be able to understand exactly what it means to bow down to the lotus feet of Krishna, but Srila Prabhupada has given us this process by which we are bowing down to Krishna's lotus feet, because the feet are on the ground. So by bowing down on the ground as low as we can get, that's really what we're trying to do. We're trying to get as low as possible on the ground, as low as possible. So, okay, I don't know exactly how to bow down to Krishna's lotus feet, but I'm just going to get down as low as possible. And And Srila Prabhupada set this own example. Whenever he came to the temple and the deities, he would immediately go to the altar and pay full obeisances to the deities, even when he was very old and very diseased. He would still do it. So while we're still relatively healthy, we should take this opportunity to, as often as possible, pay our obeisances. And it's such a simple act, in comparison to some of the other processes of Krishna consciousness. It's very simple, and it's very pleasing when the spiritual master sees this. But there are paying obeisances, also reciting prayers when we come to see the deity, also reciting prayers in our mind when we see the devotees. We can recite some prayers in our mind when we see devotees, just to remind us of our good fortune. And then when we see something which is detrimental, then perhaps we can remember some verses that to remind us to be careful not to take this association, and not to protect ourselves from that association. So one reason Srila Prabhupada was so strict and so much stressed these principles was because he saw how even in the Vaishnava tradition, it became very corrupted over time because people became negligent of these simple principles. So I remember when I was in the brahmachari ashram, we were over enthusiastic to pay obeisances, and we had to be sort of discouraged from being quite so enthusiastic, because we would pay obeisances everywhere, out in the city center and everywhere in the mud. In fact, that was actually considered to be the greatest surrender, would be to surrender into a pool of water in front of a devotee. So anyway, but now we've understood that that's not so good, because people think that we're really crazy, and also it means our clothes look really dirty afterwards. So we can pay our obeisances to senior devotees when they can't see us, so that they don't have to, out of their humility, they'll return their obeisances, but it's best that they don't see us paying obeisances, because then it means they have to pay obeisances lots of times. For example, if all of the devotees pay their obeisances all the time when they see this temple president, then he has to pay obeisances 20 times a day. So, but we should do it at least once when we see the temple president we should pay obeisances somewhere at a distance where they can't see us, and we can pay obeisances to each other in that way as well. So it's a nice activity. And when we're on the ground, we can say the prayer nicely with full attention. Say the whole prayer, because there's such nice prayers. And when you're on the ground, it's somehow or other it means a lot more, because you're doing something which is unusual for the body, then the body kind of pays attention. But if you're just doing something which is kind of easy or even negligent, then you won't be paying attention to the mantra, and therefore you won't be getting the benefits. And it's not actually. There's one verse in the Bhagavad Gita which stresses paying obeisances. Does anyone know that verse? It's a very important verse. It appears twice in the Bhagavad Gita. It's the only verse that appears twice in the Bhagavad Gita. Pardon? Manmana. Manmana bhavabad makto. Manmana, what does that mean? Manmana, yeah, think of me. Bhavamad bhakto. Yeah, become my devotee. Manmana madhyajimam, worship me. Madhyaji, mam namaskaru, and offer obeisances. So, offer obeisances can also mean offer prayers, but Srila Prabhupada specifically says it means bowing down before me. And it's very pleasing to Krishna to see us bowing down, because he understands that by that act, we're renouncing the crazy hedonistic society that says, I'm going to bow down to no one. You know, right? And so, yeah, and because we've got that in our hearts, that we don't want to bow down to anyone. So just by this act of bowing down, like paying full obeisances, or at least putting 4 of your limbs on the floor, so that's both your knees and both your hands and your head, so 5 of your limbs. And then that's actually, you're getting real benefit. You're getting Krishna's blessings, and you're performing the activity in such a way that you'll remember why am I doing this? Well, I'm doing this because it's beneficial for me. I'm doing this because it helps me remember the mantra that I've been given, which is like so beautiful, such a beautiful mantra, like the mantra. Srila Prabhupada composed this mantra. Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prasthaya Bhutale Srimati Bhaktivedanta Swamini Namane. That's the first part of the mantra, which is similar to all of the mantras of the previous acharyas. But then he felt that it was necessary to add another part. So I don't know the whole reason why he did it, but one thing that I've found is because it's another part and it's more detailed, then we're more likely to meditate on the meaning of it rather than just saying it automatically. So Namaste Saraswati Devi, this means I offer obeisances unto him who has adopted the philosophy of his spiritual master, Srila Bhakti Siddhanta. Gauravani Pracharane, he's widely preaching the teachings of Lord Chaitanya, and is delivering the Western world by removing impersonalism and voidism. So there's a lot in there. He spent several weeks like thinking about how to give us a mantra that will enable us to meditate not just on him, but meditate on Srila Bhakti Siddhanta and on the Goswamis and on Lord Chaitanya, all in those 2 lines. So it's a great gift. And so yesterday Tokshu was talking about chanting unlimited rounds off the beads, and it's not easy. It's not easy if your heart's not purified. But by having the process of paying obeisances, then whenever we bow down, it's an opportunity to recite a very purifying mantra. It's a mantra describing prema bhakti in the form of Srila Prabhupada's life. Okay. Are there any comments or questions? Pip?
I have a question about in the translation of that one. And we're talking about gambling and the fact that beats is a Shakti mountain now.
So can you speak a little louder?
Had to turn down the gambling match on her phone. But how can I understand this when, for us, it goes against the 4 regulative principles?
So as far as I understand your question, in various sections of Srila Prabhupada's books and in the Mahabharata describes that the Kshatriyas engaged in gambling matches like playing dice, wagers, um, and at the same time that it's one of the prohibitions for devotees. Um, so within all of the varnas and the varnashram system, for each varna, for the brahmins, the kshatriyas, the grihastas, and the shudras, there are different rules and regulations, which are in line with the psychophysical nature of that ashram and the psychophysical nature of the members of that ashram, to enable them to have some regulated sense gratification, which will also regulate the sense gratification in the association of other members of the ashram, so that even if that regulated sense gratification starts to get out of hand, and they're in the association of their teachers and their peers who can like nip things in the bud and not let it get out of hand totally. Whereas if those kind of activities are performed between sections of different communities with different regulations, then it will lead to violence and all sorts of moral degradation. So I know in the Mahabharata, it was seen as a gambling match that did lead to degradation. So that should, that really should bring us to the platform of dhyana, thinking, actually all of these kind of social conventions ultimately lead to degradation because the spiritual element has been neglected. So it's actually Srila Prabhupada says in Bhagavad Gita chapter 3 verse 34. In the purport. Indriyasya te ragadvesha vyavastito tayonavashamagachet toyasya paripantino. There are principles to regulate attachment and aversion pertaining to the senses and their objects. One should not come under the control of such attachment and aversion because they are stumbling blocks on the path of self-realization. So there are principles to regulate attachment and aversion. In the different ashrams, there's different principles, but one should not come under the control of them. So you shouldn't, so the Kshatriyas may occasionally have a gambling match to fulfill that sort of desire, that kind of swashbuckling, nature that they have. But if it becomes a habitual thing, then they'll be degraded by it. And that's the case with all of our activities. So we may, for example, we have a Sunday feast every week, and we relish the opulent prasadam. But if we had a Sunday feast every day, then we would actually become those of us who are not very renounced would become addicted to eating very opulent food, which would mean when a situation arose when we can't eat very opulent food, then we become frustrated. Okay. In the purport of this verse, Sri Prabhupada says, as long as the material body is the necessities of the material body are around, the rules and regulations, and yet we should not rely upon the control of such alliances. One has to follow those rules and regulations unattached to them, because practice of sense gratification and the regulations may also lead one to stray. As much there is always the chance of an accident, even on the royal roads. So those concessions to sense gratification within the ashram are given as a kind of safety valve to allow a little regulated sense gratification. But it has to be practiced with the mood that we should feel fortunate to have that opportunity, but understand that we've got that opportunity is so that we can go back to our regular activities with more enthusiasm and perhaps more like friendship with the people who we're working with. So it's like a social event allows us to develop perhaps more friendship with the people who we have to undergo some austerity with. Just like if it's going to have to fight a battle, then it's good if they're really good friends with the people that they're fighting with. It's understandable. Grantra Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Srimad Bhagavatam ki, Shishikoda Nizai Bhagavatam Shishiki, Nizai Bhagavatam. Let's go to Srimad ki.